Thank you all for having me. My name is Ariel Barak. I work for the Dane County Human Services Department. I do lots of different things, but one of the things that I do also is look at youth justice data. And this is, I guess, my second time, I think, this year presenting this slideshow. I'll be presenting it again in a couple weeks here. Basically, the gist of what I'm intending to do here is to talk about kind of from the beginning to about what I would say is the middle of the youth justice system. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the youth population in Dane County. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about offenses that are occurring, a little bit about arrests that are happening, and then about referrals that are coming both to the district attorney's office and to the human services department. So that's about where, as far as I'm going. I'm not getting into judicial decisions after that, corrections, things like that, secure detention. Those are all things that are not part of this presentation. So that's kind of the frame. The data about population is coming from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. Information about offenses and arrests are coming from the Wisconsin Department of Justice. They run what's called the Uniform Crime Reporting Program, which is a federal program where folks are supposed to be counting crime the same way across the country. And then finally, we'll be talking about law enforcement referrals, and those are that data is coming from an internal human services database. Obviously, the source data are referrals that are coming from police. So that's kind of the broad framework of what we're going to be talking about. This slide shows the juvenile population aged 10 to 17. The bar in blue is white non-Hispanic youth, and the bar in red is our minority youth or kids of color. As you can see, the blue bar is decreased a little bit across time there from 37,000 and change to a little under 35. Number of kids of color increased from about 5,800 to over 14,000 across this time period. And so when we look at this by individual group here, we see the same blue bar from the prior slide is up here, and then here we see Hispanic, Black, Asian, and American Indian youth. This is the nomenclature that OJJDP, the data source, uses for these populations. And when we zoom in on this group here, this is what we see, right? So going back, it's kind of hard to see exactly what's happening, but zooming in, this is what's happening, right? So white non-Hispanic kids are above the ceiling, right, at 35,000 or so. So this is the zoom in here, and we see that in the last few years, Hispanic youth have increased in population compared to Black or African American youth. We see increases for Asian youth and a pretty steady count of American Indian youth.
So I'm sorry. Here. So the juvenile population is not number of juveniles in the community, it's a number in the system of Dane County, correct?
These are the number of kids, period, not involved in anything. This is how many kids are there.
Just clarify.
Yep, thank you. And then before we get into kind of some of the rest for lay people, this is kind of my very rough approximation of the youth justice system up to the point of a district attorney's decision here. So we've got kids, right? We've got juveniles. We've got a potential offense. A youth may be arrested for that offense. And at arrest, there might be some alternative, like some type of restorative justice, some kind of circle option. There might be a citation for municipal court, or that arrest could be referred to the district attorney's office and the human services department. So this is kind of the most formal and serious mechanism. And when that referral comes to Human Services does an intake or an assessment and makes a recommendation to the district attorney's office. The district attorney's office then is free to do what they will. So we have, Human Services has a crack at the bat in terms of the assessment, and then finally the DA's decision about whether it could be, whether they're going to choose to petition a kid formally, which might lead to supervision or corrections, or if there are other deferred prosecution agreements, counsel and release, all kinds of other options. Just to jump in here about these alternatives, these can happen kind of anywhere in the system. So it could be that a kid might not need to be arrested if in a certain municipality there's an arrangement set up where, you know, it might not require an arrest to get a kid into some type of diversionary program. Some programs require an arrest as an alternative, and the DA could say, well, we want a deferred prosecution agreement, which could be considered to be some type of alternative. So this is here just kind of in one spot, but really depending on the municipality, it can kind of float around in different areas. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay.
Hey, Ariel,
Yeah.
in that last slide, insert JRC. So
Yeah, so this is not meant to be in terms of what's happening with the kid. This is kind of what's happening with the paperwork or the referral, right? So depending on what's happening in terms of the offense, it could be that a kid then is brought to JRC for a custody order, and they're going to be making a decision about whether the kid is a threat to the community or a threat to not appear in court. So if one of those two things is deemed, and there's a whole chapter about what is supposed to be factored into that, then a kid might be held in secure detention, but that's not part of this flow here. So obviously a kid would need to be arrested before being brought to JRC on a new crime. So this is given a kid that doesn't have a prior criminal history. This isn't a kid that's on supervision. This is just kind of fresh kiddo.
And I think part of the thing is we have many more complex flowchart processes. This was just to give a quick and dirty, you know, this is what happens when an offense takes place or potentially.
those ending decision points as far as human services and their intake assessment recommendation is sped up dramatically if custody is involved with referral to JRC. That's within hours versus 40 days.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Jack, you go back to a couple of slides in our population here, just so that it's clearer to me. When you say the juvenile population is of age 10 to 17, a 17-year-old is automatically waived into adult courts of original jurisdiction.
Right, yes. So age of majority in Wisconsin, correct, right. The reason why I have that cut, 10 to 17, is because the UCR system, which I'm going to be using as the numerator for some things, they don't care about a state's age of majority. Juvenile arrests to the feds are age 10 to 17. We don't care about. So that's the reason. Yes, the number of not all kids that are arrested as juveniles in the FBI counts in Wisconsin would be eligible, right? So those 17-year-olds that are counting here as arrests would not be kind of under the purview of any of the discussion that we're having today. So yes, good.
And I just raise that as a point of perhaps future consideration for this body of work, because frankly, I'm not so sure that the legislature made the right decision by lowering that age to 17. I think that's created more problems for disparities, as that might be a subtopic that we'd like to look at and weigh in on down the road. Thank you.
Yeah, and just to jump in on that, I think Wisconsin it's one of like, it's the vast minority of states that treat 17-year-olds automatically as, so I think, yeah, so it's a handful, like 4. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about offenses. So this is, and I've got links at the bottom here. A Part 1 offense. These are what are considered the violent index offenses. So murder and non-negligent manslaughter, rape, aggravated assault and robbery on the property end, burglary, motor vehicle theft, larceny, theft, and arson. And this is kind of just a brief, the reporting of offenses known is limited to the following crime classifications, et cetera, et cetera. So there are kind of 2 types of UCR systems. There's one that's called incident-based, which not every Dane County law enforcement agency is using, and then there's one called summary. So all the arrest data that's collected in the more detailed incident side can be crunched and kind of dummied down into the summary side, and that's what I've done so that I can give a holistic view of all law enforcement agencies in Dane County. So in the incident-based reporting, there are more categories that get reported, but for the summary basis, it's just these 8 here. Okay, so what I've done here is I've taken the number of violent crimes, right, which we talked about right here, and basically took the number of those offenses divided by the total county population, right? So that's everybody, age 0 to 100 and whatever. So after we do that, then we get an offense rate, right? And we can compare that offense rate across time. So this is per 100,000, so we can see that it was 325-ish per 100,000 in 97, and then to 2016 it's 220, and then there was a little bit of a spike there, a little over 250. So this spike here in the violent offense rate was due to a large increase in the number of aggravated assaults. So that went up from 683 to 886. I guess another thing to kind of note about the violent offense rate is that it's largely driven by aggravated assaults. So in 2017, the number of, the percent, of violent crimes, 65% of violent crimes were aggravated assault. So that's the big driver, right? So the number of murders, the number of rapes is very small compared to the number of aggravated assaults. So that's kind of the driver of this index.
Does that mean fights? What is aggravated assault?
So aggravated assaults generally would be like substantial battery. So
Where you need a stitch, you have a chip to lose consciousness.
yes.
To which there were many downtown on a Saturday night, for example.
Yes. Yes. Okay, and then on the property end, similar, a different situation, right? A little bit more of a nosedive here. We were at, but now think about the scale here. So this was 350 per 100,000. Now we're getting into 3,500 per 100,000, right? So an order of magnitude different. So if we're looking at the violent crime, it would be a little red line right here, right? Very small compared to the property offense rate. And this is largely driven by theft. So 80% in 2017 of offenses were theft of these index property offenses. Does that make sense? Okay. So this is the UCR definition of an arrest. So it counts one arrest for each separate instance in which a person is arrested, cited, or summoned for an offense. So this system counts municipal citations as arrests. So just as a clarifier. And here we've got the number of total arrests in Dane County from 97 to 2017. So we see, we kind of were at highs in 98, 99, and then 2007, 2009, a little less than 35,000 arrests. And the red is juvenile arrests, the blue adult arrests. So what do we notice? I mean, we see like a decrease here in the number of adults arrested, but we see a gigantic decrease in the number of juveniles arrested. So here we were at almost 10,000, and then now we're at a little around 3,000. So a very large decrease in the number of juvenile arrests while that population has been growing, right? So those two things are happening at the same time.
What's the skin in this, and I studied it very seldom, the trend line for both populations is similar.
For which populations?
For both populations, the juvenile population in red or orange, and then the adult population in blue. The trend line seems to be similar for both, ups and downs in the same years. Is that a correlation that has been picked on, identified, or pulled out? Or that, overstating the obvious?
I think generally speaking, crime across the country has been decreasing over the last 20-some years. In terms of a driver, I think it'd be, I wouldn't want to speak to what is happening exactly. I'm kind of giving kind of what's going on here, and I guess I would say that although things are happening at the same time, they're very different in terms of the size of this blue bar. Yes, it decreased, but the size of this blue bar is nowhere near 1/3 of what it was in the maximum year, right? So if we compare this bar here to here, right, it's a totally different deal. And on the next slide here, we're looking at the arrest rates per thousand. So now we're looking at adults and kids, and what we see is a really, really sharp decrease in the juvenile arrest rate over time. So kids are, my editorial is I think kids are being treated differently across time here, because we see a change here for adults, but in terms of for juveniles, it's really dramatic. And then when we look at these by juvenile arrests by race, so first off, the UCR system, Hispanic or Latino ethnicity is not a mandated category. So basically the requirements are that arrests be broken by race, which they categorize as white, black, American Indian, or Asian. The number of Asian and Native arrests is so minuscule that when I did this slide and broke them out separately, you couldn't see the color. It was just the black outline. So I've lumped those two together for the purposes kind of clarity here.
What do the Latino kids usually get lumped in as white or?
Yeah, so I mean, so the way that the U.S. Census and some of the population data crunches things is, there's race and ethnicity, and those are two separate deals. In Dane County, like 90% of youth and adults also are white in terms of race. So and 10% is something else. So yeah, in Dane County, I would say most of the Hispanic or Latino arrests you're going to see in the blue lines here. Okay, so what do we see across time? We see, the red bar is staying more or less pretty similar here. I mean, there was kind of a surge in 2006, 7, but then it kind of came back to about the same size it was in 2007. And then for white youth here, we see the number of white youth arrested just drop from about 7,000 to a little less than 2,000. And we can do the same thing then, right? When we compare these arrests, so sorry, this is stacked one on top of each other. This one here is then, overlaid here. So at the same time, we can see these trends happening. So the number of black youth that were arrested increased to almost 3,000 and then has come down to 1,500 or so. The number of white youth arrested was at 7,000 and now is at about that same number, 1,500. But vastly different populations, right, in terms of what's in the denominator. So when you divide the number of black youth arrested divided by the number of black youth here, you've got this red bar here. So this is the arrest rate for black youth and the arrest rate for white youth here. So, I mean, at one point here, like this was in 98, there were 850 black youth arrested per 1,000, right? I mean, it's hard to imagine, versus, here, a little less than 200. So although this line looks like it's decreasing much faster, this line here is actually almost an 80% decrease, while this here is about a 55% decrease. So the number are both going in the same direction, but at different speeds. And what we do when we talk about disparities, one of the ways to do that is compare the two rates. So if we take 850 and divide it by 190, we get this number here. So this basically compares the rate of arrest for black youth compared to white youth, with white youth kind of being the norm here at 1, the majority population. We can compare the rates. So the majority population here would always be 1, and then you can look at any other group on top here. So two things are kind of happening at the same time, which are interesting, right? So the number of black youth arrested has decreased, but at the same time, the disparities, when you look at the rates, that rate has increased, and that's driven mainly because the number of white youth arrested has decreased faster than the number of black youth arrested. So the UCR program categorizes arrests in a few different ways here. There's about 25 of them. Basically, this chart here shows the differences, the percentages of arrests by race in a different by category. So here at the top is the total number of arrests in 2018. So there were 2,877, and you see kind of the percentage split between white, black, and other. But you can look between different crime types. There's, liquor law, which is, 85% of the 194 were for white youth who were arrested for liquor law. You can look at some, stolen property here. 90% black youth that were arrested. So you can see that it's, it's not consistent. There's a lot of variation by type of crime. And these crimes here that are listed here, these types, account for about 99% of all arrests.
Is this also broken down further by household income?
No, that's not part of the UCR program. Yeah, unfortunately.
Gender?
Can
it be disaggregated by gender?
Yes, it's every time I explain it to people, it's kind of mind-blowing.
Okay.
The tables don't collect the data by all three of those. So by race, gender, and age, it doesn't get you all three of those in the same table. So you can't say the number of 15-year-old female white youth that are arrested. You can get some of it, but not the other, with the summary type. For all the law enforcement officials here and the chiefs and whatnot, I guess I would implore you to convert to IBR if you're not using the IBR data system, because that type of data, that system gives us the more granular look at all this. And once all law enforcement agencies use that, I'll be happy to dig into this and do those kinds of looks.
Wasn't it mandated by 2021?
They haven't, I think that's the intention, but they haven't come out and said it quite in that, as strongly, yes. But I think they've said that the summary side is going away, but they haven't said thou shalt use the IBR system. Okay, so for the next few slides, we're going to be talking about a JJ referral. You can interchange that youth justice referral right now. Basically, this, as we saw in the flow chart, this is, so a kid, there's been an alleged offense, there's been an arrest, and now where the Human Services Department and the District Attorney's Office is receiving a report, and they're basically asking for a charging decision, some type of charging decision. So,
And both of those happen at the same time?
Yeah, we receive them both at the same time. Human Services generally, will do an intake or an assessment, send that to the District Attorney's Office, and then the District Attorney's Office will make a decision about whether they're gonna, they could waive the kid, which doesn't happen, into the adult system. They could petition the kid formally. They could DPA, home county. There's lots of different things, but ultimately I kind of create a binary system of, did this go formal, meaning did they petition this kid to have them put on supervision, or did they do something else, anything else? So I kind of create a binary system here. So first we're going to talk a little bit about the number of those referrals and kind of who's coming in the door here. So here we've got the number of referrals, and I think the main take home here is that the referrals generally follow what's happening in terms of arrests, right? So if arrests crashed, we would generally assume that the number of JJ referrals decreases also. We see some of the same types of disparities here. We see, more black youth referred than white. And of course, that's part of the flow, right? In terms of, well, what happened before that? Well, it's the number of kids arrested, right? So we can kind of follow the lines here. Okay, so when we look specifically here, we see what was about a 26% decrease for black youth referrals here, and then we see a 30% jump from 16 to 17, and we don't see that jump for white youth, and you can see the chart here.
I think one other thing that comment you can now see Hispanic youth shows up here, because those are referrals that come to us rather than the larger system where we don't know. And so we get those referrals with families that we are able to identify that and have that in our system. So at the level that it comes to us, we have the data around Hispanic Latino youth that we can pull out.
Yep. It's kind of one of the ironies is that, law enforcement generally is using, is identifying, arrests, but it's just not part of the required fields. And so law enforcement knows, but it's just not part of what gets sent to the to DOJ.
So, Ariel, the juvenile arrest by race slide showed that a significant number of white juveniles are arrested more than blacks. But the previous slide showed more black juveniles are referred to juvenile justice.
Yep, and
It's almost flipped.
well, and so some of that is, so they're going to be, generally there's kind of an agreement basically that certain offenses are going to be petitioned in a formal manner. So the DA is going to be, petitioning people who have committed homicide or, broken people, use firearms, things like that. And so while the raw numbers, yeah, that's correct. I think that's where you get into the differences in the types of offenses that are occurring that are driving whether referrals come to us. Generally, we're not seeing, you'll see further on kind of what kinds of statutes we see on the referrals that come to us, but the majority of stuff that gets deflected, via citation or via some kind of restorative justice, those are generally speaking going to be misdemeanors. And the felonies are much more likely to be coming to us as JJ referrals. Can people hear me in the back? Am I talking loud enough? Yes, okay, great.
I'm just going to do a time check. We've got about 20 minutes. I'm not sure if you want to get to this live and have time for Q&A. I know we've been interrupting with the questions.
Sure. So I've got 10 left, or I've got?
You've got 20 left.
20 left. Oh, I think.
As you wish in terms of Q&A spread throughout, or until the end.
Sure, okay.
So 20 including your Q&A.
Yes, okay. I'll try to hustle a little here. Is this clicker going to go? No. Can I have, this is not happy with me, I guess. Oh boy. Let's see. Okay. All right, so this chart here shows the percent of arrests that are then getting referred, right? So we know how many kids are arrested. We know how many referrals we receive. And so this shows, one divided by the other. So for every 40 arrests for every 100 arrests in 2017, we saw about 40 referrals for black youth. And for white youth, for every 100 arrests, we saw about 20 referrals, right? So similarly to what we did before, we can divide one by the other. And then we've kind of got this RRI, which is the relative rate. RRI, I'm blanking, geez.
Index.
Yes, thank you, Andre. Index. So we saw much larger disparities at arrest, right? Then now those disparities are much smaller at kind of the next step here. So we see that the disparity is about twice, right? So this red line is about twice as high as this blue line, right? So that's what we see here. And here we've got the number of referrals and then the number of unique kids, right? So 493 unique kids, right, that we could name, right? Joe, Tom, whatever. 924 referrals, so referrals that we've received from law enforcement. So we see that, although interestingly in 17, the number of referrals went up, the number of unique kids referred to us actually went down by a couple. And looking at this by gender, so now on the right-hand side, this is for unique youth by gender, and then here we've got the number of referrals by gender. So in 17, 359 males accounted for 687 referrals. So, same deal, 134 females, 237 referrals. Same deal for race here. So we've got unique kids by gender here on the right-hand side, so black, white, and Hispanic youth, unique kids, and then on the left-hand side we've got the number of referrals. These are age pyramids. So here we've got in blue males and in red females. This is 15, 16, and 2017, and then with each set here you've got age. So as we see, 16-year-olds, we're seeing more of them than any other group, and you can see, obviously, more boys than girls. And now here we're breaking it by all for 2017, breaking it then not just by gender, but by gender and race/ethnicity. So here we've got black, white, and Hispanic. So you can see here, this is the number of Hispanic youth referred by age and by gender here. Any questions about the population pyramid stuff? No? Okay.
There's nothing that we have that breaks down the repeat referrals, right?
Not yet. Good question. It's coming.
All right, I'll wait.
Okay. You got it, because that's the order of the slides. This is showing the number of referrals that the DA's office and Human Services are receiving per month. So basically, I'm doing this to show you that it's kind of pretty like, whoa, you know, large increase. This chart shows the number of those referrals by law enforcement agency per year. So up here, of course, is Madison PD. You know, in 2013, over 600 referrals came from Madison PD. Now in 2017, that number was 323. So actually, the number of referrals from Madison PD decreased by a few, 328 to 323. But then for almost all the other kind of smaller suburban agencies, we saw increases. Sun Prairie was very modest, but Waunakee, Dane County Sheriff, Fitchburg, Middleton, Verona, and Stoughton all had, you know, pretty large increases. And so here I'm zooming in on that. So Madison PD is way up here, right? 600 to 300. Now looking at some of these more smaller suburban law enforcement agencies, and you can see here, right? Spike, 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 spike. You know, one that's staying more or less the same here, and one that went down a little bit, but the majority of them are increasing. So where are these referrals occurring? Our system captures some of that information. So most frequently, these are happening on school grounds. This doesn't specifically mean that the youth was arrested by a school resource officer or an ERO. This just means this is where it happened. It could have been on a school day, could have been in the summer, could have been whatever, but on school grounds. We've got vehicle, we've got home, etc. So, you know, basically we're seeing the large driver, school, vehicle, and home. And one of the things folks have always been interested in is what percent, you know, is this stuff happening at school? And so here we've got the percent across time. So how many referrals? In 2017, there were 187 referrals that happened at school out of 924. So it's, you know, actually as low as it was in 2012. And this chart basically shows that school isn't a contributor to the racial disparities that we see. The same percentage, the percentage of black youth that are referred at school versus referred generally. So 17% of those referrals are happening at school versus white youth. 23% of referrals of white youth are coming from schools or on school grounds. So. Yeah, so that just kind of, it is what it is. It doesn't appear that school is adding any additional amount of disparity to the already large disparities that we see, generally speaking. And this slide breaks things into referrals that generally will be petitioned formally. So here we're calling it automatic formal. Nothing is automatic. There's always, you know, options for, you know, where things might go one way or the other. But you can see that generally across time, there's been an increase in the number of referrals that have come in where there's one or more statutes that generally are going to be petitioned formally. So that's on this side. Here we're breaking it by race here. So we see that in the last few years, in prior years, black youth were less likely to be coming to the district attorney's office and to Human Services with a referral that had one of those statutes. Now this number is, you know, 40% compared to 25%, say. So things have changed dramatically in the last few years in terms of the percentage of referrals that have one of these formal violations. And then on the other side here, the trend is pretty similar because these are the referrals that have a felony charge on them, right? So not necessarily are all felonies going to have an automatic formal, but generally it's similar, and, you know, we see pretty similar data trends. How much time do I have? Do I have 10 minutes left, maybe? Okay.
13.
Hi, Teresa.
Hi.
Hi.
Long time no see.
Yeah.
When you say school, are you talking about schools outside of Madison, or are you talking about Madison Public Schools?
Schools, period. Yeah, this is all schools in Dane County.
Thank you.
Yes. Thanks. And then one of the things we wanted to look at is the number of, I think there was a thought that, well, maybe African Americans are coming to the district attorney's office or human services with more charges per referral. So one referral could have multiple statute violations, right? And so this looks at the average number of charges per referral, and we see that in the last few years things are pretty similar. One between 1.6 and 1.8 charges per referral. And then this is a little bit of a different look, right? Because averages can be misleading. This is just the number with multiples, and again, you see pretty similar numbers here for white youth and black youth having multiple charges per referral. And these are like David Letterman's top 10 list, right? So these are the most frequent charges we're seeing. Now, keep in mind you can have multiple charges per referral, but here we see misdemeanor disorderly conduct. That's the only type there is. Et cetera. Damage to property, battery, theft, et cetera. Resisting or obstructing an officer. And you can see, there have been large decreases over time for disorderly conduct. You can see increases in, damage to property, theft, resisting or obstructing an officer. And here we've got felony omvoc. So these are going to be kids that have stolen the car themselves, not passengers. And then here we've got the misdemeanors, and these are generally going to be the kids that were passengers or who happened to return a car within less than 24 hours without any damage. Not very likely, but yes.
Is the nature of what a disorderly arrest is different for juveniles versus adults? I mean, like, what usually constitutes disorderly? Oh,
it's one of my favorite statutes because it's as broad. You could drive a semi-truck through it. I don't have it committed to memory. It's 94701. Yes. I couldn't quote it for you.
Someone is
likely to cause a disturbance. It's one of the most broad categories. That's the same.
So who determines the charge? It starts with the police officer or the judge?
So generally speaking, the kind of the order of events would be that law enforcement would say, I am arresting you for X. Then if there's disorderly conduct, right? If it's if they might choose, so there are some versions, some crimes, right, where if it's over a certain dollar amount, then maybe that bumps it into felony, right, like theft. There might be a dollar amount that switches something from a misdemeanor to a felony. And so, there's obviously perception of what's happening, right, like, and disorderly conduct is a good example of, is that really disorderly? I mean, you could ask 100 people, not all of them are going to say the same thing.
But the DA's office or wherever down the road, there's a number of different places where that gets evaluated, and if there's a more fitting charge, then they'll adjust it to make it so. Or if there's no other charge and this one doesn't fit,
But if I
then drop
have
it.
a very skilled attorney, where would he or she engage to make sure that charge benefits me and not the system?
Depends on how much money you have. If they have, the public defender isn't assigned to this charge. So if they have, family has money, most wealthy families I see is that they're hiring an attorney before there's actual charge, and they begin negotiations with the DA's office to try to come up with a consent decree or even a DPA. And the DPA doesn't even come before the court. It is agreed to outside of the court system. And then the consent decree for prosecution. Okay. And they can be negotiated outside the presence of the court, so that we never even see. I don't even know if those kids show up on the doorstep, but the kids who don't have that, generally it's not till after the charge is filed, and then the public defender comes into it.
To that point, when is someone CCAP?
Juveniles are not, you can't CCAP juveniles unless they are waived into adult jurisdiction.
It's not juvenile CCAP is not a public system. So no one can look up and see, any youth's juvenile record.
Unless they are waived or in jurisdiction.
But to Dr. Wright's question, 17 and older CCAP is when they're first appear in court.
Which is their original adult jurisdiction. But no kid can, unless they're adult, unless they are original jurisdiction. They can be 15 years old.
It's not my time, it's your time.
And that's still on CCAP.
Okay.
and were they incarcerated, or what degree the offense?
Are disorderlies ever considered a felony?
No.
No.
And they could also be a municipal citation, so there's some discretion at the point when law enforcement has contact as to whether they're gonna issue a citation, municipal citation, or they're gonna refer to our department, the DA, for a charge, and a lot of different considerations go in at that point as well.
So theoretically, once someone is arrested, or youth is arrested, what's the time frame for the arrangement of a deferred prosecution agreement?
So, as John was mentioning earlier, so most kids that are arrested don't go through jail, juvenile reception center. Like sometimes that's a perception that people have, that most kids that are arrested actually go through juvenile reception center, are held, or something else. If they're held, all the time frames accelerate. If they're not, which is the majority, then we get the referral in our department at the same time the district attorney does. Our social workers have 40 days to assess that youth and family, and then make a recommendation back to the district attorney's office. We want to counsel and close this case, which things just end and it doesn't go further. We want to do a deferred prosecution agreement, and here are the conditions within that deferred prosecution agreement. Or we think it should go formal, and for the purposes of formal, that would also be a consent decree or an adjudication. The district attorney at that same time is making the determination whether it's sufficient for prosecution, whether they have enough evidence to proceed. And then we're not always in agreement. So we may recommend a deferred prosecution agreement saying we can provide service A, B, C, and D without it going in front of a judge. And the DA may say, no, I think this needs to have oversight of the court and oversight of the district attorney. And they come back to court. At that point, a judge could say, yes, this needs to be formal and stay in the system and adjudicate or do a consent decree. Or they could say, no, I think it actually can be a DPA, and the department may take this back, and then it's not a formal case, but they've gone to court, but the court has sent it back to a deferred prosecution.
So
Do you keep track, I'm sorry, do you keep track of the ones where DA disagrees with your recommendations?
Next slide.
Before you get to that, I guess my question is about the haves and the have-nots. When, it's great that someone would have counsel and they could work this out. But let's say for those that look like me that don't have money, how oftentimes are they in a situation where there is no deferred prosecution because there is no attorney?
All juveniles are assigned an attorney.
Okay.
So there's really, I can't think of any situation where a juvenile is in court and is not getting back.
You mentioned something about somebody working something out. That's kind of what I'm trying to say. I'm talking about an active attorney, one who gets a lot of money. I'm not talking about someone who's in there on the fly. Again, this is a visceral situation. I'm really interested in what happens to the poor kids.
Right. So honestly,
That's what I'd like to hear.
I think for the most part, the public defenders actually do a better job than the private attorneys. The private attorneys don't really know juvenile very well. They don't know the processes. That's not to say that they're not going to come in and argue and be at that point. Anything proactive that a parent does beforehand can impact the potential trajectory that things are going to go. But there always can be negotiations, and frequently there are negotiations even between the public defender and the district attorney as to there's 3 different charges that came in. We're willing to dismiss and read in a charge, to drop this charge, to amend a charge. So there's frequently negotiations that take place, whether it's a public defender or a private attorney. But in general, I would say I think the public defenders actually do a better job than the private attorney.
So the poor kids have a shot.
Let me push back on that thesis, Brother Andre, and I'll be quick, don't have to respond to it. I'm going to push back on that, given my experience working with families, with juveniles, going through the system, and they get attorneys who are not out of the public defender's office, but they're from, what do y'all call it? Private bar. And I'm going to argue that many of those attorneys that I met had Do you consider those private attorneys or public? I consider those public because they are the jurisdiction of the court. It's the court who's assigned of those attorneys.
Yeah, but I still consider those private for the purposes of this conversation. Non-public defender.
The public defender office only has, what, five?
Five, right.
Five attorneys. And if there's a conflict within those five, they send it out to the private bar.
Yes,
And the
that's
private
right.
bar is assigned to those, to represent those juveniles. So what Andre's talking about is collectively, you have a few exceptions, but collectively, the majority of the private attorneys that intersect with the court system, they don't do a good job to represent the interests of the juveniles.
Yeah.
They do a very poor job, mainly because there's lack of training, lack of understanding of the process, and really lack of time.
They don't have enough reps.
So the public defenders, for Ben and Eileen and Mitch, every time they're with and I've seen them actually take over cases from private bar and do a more excellent job for the families than before.
I've seen that, but I've seen more often this scenario that when those attorneys from the private bar are assigned, they bring in more resources. And they have been able, in the situation I've seen, to apply those resources to those families and get better outcomes.
Generally not. They're paid a set amount of money to represent that
Right.
kid. Where we see some of the disparity is for those parents who are able to hire private attorneys. Straight private
Oh, I
attorneys,
agree
not
with
through the
that.
public defender's office.
Yeah.
Like Dr. Rhodes said, there are some instances, and what we see those cases happening in more often are the sexual assault cases.
Yeah.
Where there's a detective assigned and the case takes a while to really evolve and it be charged out by police. And there's time for that attorney to get in there, if there's money, and have some influence potentially.
I think that, Greg, what you're referring to is what John just mentioned, is those, if you have the funds, right, to hire a private attorney, then they can hire an investigator who goes out, investigates, and really do an all-out sort of, investigation for their client.
For the attorney and the client.
Yeah, and it's very limited. I think the public defenders within the state office do a really good job because they have their own investigators.
Say that again.
I know it's, it is mandated that they
But
use.
very
their
few go to
funds.
trial. I don't even know what the percentage is. It's like, like 2%, 1% actually go to trial. So it's not like on TV where you're bringing in 20 different witnesses that are, and you're so most of these settle in some manner.
But it helps with the
without a
investigator,
trial.
right? I think it helps with
it doesn't hurt.
with these witnesses, right?
But-
A statement to settle the case, right? And
But also, the
oftentimes.
kids talk, so they make the worst defendants. So they talk. It's rarely you have a case where a kid is silent. Right. So that's why a lot of them.
I think it bears just to remember, because we have a huge cross-section of folks with indoctrination in the system. The juvenile justice system is not as the adversarial court system that you might be familiar with, in that the court, the attorneys, everybody is looking at what's in the best interest of the child using the least restrictive options. And even for us as practitioners in the field, there's a statutory presumption to release back to someone and not to do an intake. That's in the statute.
Yep.
Okay.
I'm going to jump through some stuff. Okay, and I'm going to jump through some slides just to get through here. You all have had excellent questions and answers. Let's see. We're looking at, the Human Services Department versus the DA's decision in terms of whether to petition a kid formally, right? So this is the more serious option. We see generally things are stable over time. Looking at that by gender, our recommendations versus those of the DA. Same deal by